All right. Well, I think we've got a good showing, and I think it's a good time to just go start through the introduction. We'll still allow a little time for people to join before we get into the main content, but just wanted to start by welcoming you all. My name is Sky Biblin. I'm the communications coordinator for the Wildfire Task Force. I'll be helping run through today's workshop. Um, so we're here to get public feedback on a list of core reporting metrics that will be used to try and report and track progress on landscape resilience goals. So the plan for today, we're going to be opening up with just an introduction to core reporting metrics led by Forrest Schaefer of the task force. Then we'll be going into a presentation led by John Battles from UC Berkeley and the Science Advisory Panel for the task force. We'll be covering core reporting metrics in the context of regional resource kits and other existing efforts that are already out there. Then we'll transition to Patricia Manley from the U.S. Forest Service to go over the wildfire crisis strategy and also talk about other efforts and other applications for core metrics that are being used nationally. Next, MV Eitzel from UC Berkeley and the Science Advisory Panel will be going over the criteria used to select core reporting metrics. And finally, Nick Enstis with the task force will be sharing a list of candidate core reporting metrics, and we'll be going over our path forward and then conclude with a Q&A session. So I just want to go over some of the logistics for the workshop itself. So all feedback will be done through a Q&A as well as a survey. So the Q&A will be moderated by Jennifer Smith from USDA Climate Hub and the facilitator for the Science Advisory Panel. Please use that Q&A function to put in questions you have. And you can also use that for putting in, if you do have any logistical questions or issues, feel free to use that as well. So we will be I'll be providing a survey link into the chat, and I will do that now. We'll have one survey for the duration of the workshop. This will be an anonymous survey. However, at the end, we will ask if you'd like to provide your email, then we can follow up if we have any questions. Otherwise, it will remain anonymous. The survey is broken into survey sets, so you will have to press, while there's just one survey, you will press next to go to the next set. I will be letting you know when to go to the next set, as each one, it corresponds to individual presentations. We'll have 5 minutes after each presentation to fill out those surveys and to have that moderated Q&A. And then at the end of the workshop, we'll have about 10 minutes for any remaining questions. Now, while we have invited everyone here largely to get feedback on our list of candidate core reporting metrics, the focus of the workshop today is to be going over process and the selection of these metrics as well as their use, while the following the workshop will be the time to really go into deep review of the actual candidate core metrics themselves. So at the end of the presentation, we'll be sharing that list and then providing a survey and a separate survey link along with metric definitions. That list and these recordings as well will be posted. So with that, I will put the link for the survey into the chat, and I will turn it over to our first presenter.
Hey, hi everyone. Sky, is my audio coming through okay? All right, great. Well, good morning, everyone. Great to see such participation this morning. My name is Forrest Schaefer. I am the state coordinator of the Wildfire Task Force. Patrick Wright, our director, was hoping and expecting to be here to provide some framing and presentation, but he had an urgent matter that he was just pulled away for. So here at the task force, we have a small dedicated team, but it's also really amazing to me to think about really just the size of the task force, because I think if everyone here attending this webinar is really a part of helping to meet our shared goals throughout the state. Today, I want to reflect a little bit on why we're here. And in doing so, I was thinking about some of my really early work when I was first starting to plan projects and first starting to write grant applications to fund those projects, and laying out those projects and writing prescriptions. And even 15 years ago, I was saying to everybody around me, like, hey, it's not just about the number of acres treated that we have in these projects. It's so much more important that not every acre is equal. It's really about the ecosystem benefits that we're providing and the community protection benefits that we're providing. And yet here I am 15 years later, still talking constantly about the number of acres treated that we have completed and the number of acres treated that we can be completing moving forward, and really just touching the surface in terms of the amount of benefits that those treatments can provide. And so I'm really feeling like this is now a really great opportunity, because it's not just me talking about it, it's everyone I talk to throughout the state is talking about how we need to move beyond just acres treated as the key metric by which we measure the success of the projects or the benefits of projects. And I feel like this is the right time to come together as a task force or a community of planners, of practitioners, of policymakers, to really shift the paradigm on how we talk about and how we report on the benefits of the work that's completed and the benefits of the work yet to be done. So first, a little bit of background. At the task force, we feel that data management is really critical and central to decision making. And as a result, we focused a lot of the work of the task force and a lot of our resources on creating statewide tools and data sets. These tools and data sets support reporting. They also support project planning. And this is all through our regional resource kits, which you'll hear more about from John Battles in a little bit. So two key pieces in particular that I want to focus on that have been developed. First are the regional resource kit metrics. These are dozens and dozens of data sets that are either region-wide or statewide, curated from the perspective of what's really helpful from the point of view of planning projects. And so if you go to our website and look at regional resource kits, you'll see many, many metrics that might have value and have different sorts of values depending on which part of the region that you're in. So that's the first piece that we're bringing together today. The second piece is our efforts on interagency treatment tracking. As many of you know, we launched the beta version of the interagency treatment tracker last year. And this was really the first ever time that we've been able, across California, to have a comprehensive view of the work that's taking place across the state, whether that's federal work, whether that's state work. I will acknowledge there's still a lot of gaps to fill in terms of private projects, in terms of tribal projects. But for the first time, we really understood how close are we getting to meeting some of our aggressive shared targets, like the 1 million acre target. But yet, it's still us. It's across the state, we're talking about the number of acres that were treated. So that really gets down to the crux of what we're trying to accomplish today and what we're trying to move forward with in developing core reporting metrics, is really to provide the link between those regional resource kit metrics and the interagency treatment tracker, to have a system whereby the work that we're completing across the state can be reported in terms of the benefits to ecosystems, the benefits to communities, how resilience is being increased, rather than just simply that focus on quantitative acres treated. So that's the overall background of what we're trying to accomplish, and looking forward to hearing from our presenters and also getting feedback from you through our survey system on how we can best align those efforts. Do you want to provide one major caveat? We are focused today on the sort of metrics that flow directly from vegetation treatments. And we know that there are many more benefits of the work that we are all investing in and pushing forward that goes even far beyond the sorts of things that we can track in a spatially explicit way on a map, with GIS data sets. But today we are focused on vegetation treatments and those sort of spatially explicit metrics that are appropriate for tracking landscape resilience and the effects of landscape scale projects. And we have some other efforts underway, and I know you all have a lot of efforts underway to better understand and track metrics around things like workforce development and economics and community fire adaptation that aren't necessarily tied specifically to those landscape projects, but are a really important piece of the work that we do. A couple of the key kind of guiding principles that we want to bring into this work. First, we want to make sure that we're aligning really well with other statewide and federal mandates so that as we bring together our metrics and our treatment tracker and able to shift our mindset a little bit in how we're reporting on this work. We also want to make sure that we're not creating a completely separate system than what might be happening at the federal level or at other places of state government, or so that we have a lot of like competing or confusing efforts. You'll hear today from Pat about the national effort to develop core metrics and our needs to ensure that those efforts are complementary both at the state and federal scales. Our second key principle is we really want to elevate local and regional needs, priorities, and expertise in the sort of work that we know is happening statewide, but it isn't necessarily connected to some of these statewide processes. And that's one of the key reasons we wanted to have this workshop today, is to provide the background and be able to connect with a lot of those regional and local efforts where similar work is occurring, so we can help build alignment and consistency. Because ultimately our hope is that no matter which scale we're reporting at, whether the task force is reporting to the state or federal administration or the state or federal legislature, or regional partnerships are reporting to constituents and the public or local boards, having kind of a new beginning to align on a new vocabulary about how we report on our collective efforts is something that we ultimately hope that we can begin to align on. So to wrap this up, I was pretty surprised and also really happy to see the level of participation that we had today. We were not expecting nearly as many participants as we had sign up, especially surprising for Friday. This required changing our format slightly, so we do have the systematic survey input rather than open discussion or breakout groups. We switched to this webinar format. I really want to thank the people who put their focus in on developing this workshop and getting us here so far with these core metrics. That's Sky Biblin and Nick Enstis with the task force staff, Jen Smith with the Climate Hub. You'll hear today from MV Eitzel and John Battles with the Science Advisory Panel in UC Berkeley. And we also have Pat Manley with the Pacific Southwest Research Station. And then beyond that core group, there's the entirety of the Science Advisory Panel that is, and you'll hear from the process that they added into for the core reporting metrics from MV in a little bit, but also the multiple agency work groups that have been reviewing and contributing to this work. And we're really looking forward to broadening this out to the broader community of planners and practitioners today. So with that, we're looking forward to hearing your insights and learning more about how we can align our efforts with your all's. Thank you for taking the time to attend today, and I will pass it back to Sky.
Great. Thank you so much, Forrest, for kicking us off and providing some framing for the need of these core reporting metrics. So now we're going to go into take 5 minutes to answer those surveys. So at this point, you can answer the first set, which is really just asking about sort of where you come from, and then go on to survey set number 2. And if you can fill out survey set number 2, and then this is also a time if you have any questions based on what Forrest had just presented on, please put those into the Q&A, and we can answer those right now. So otherwise, we will come back with John Battles' presentation in about 3 more minutes, and please wrap up those survey questions and let us know if you have questions.
Sky, would you mind dropping the link to the survey in the chat again?
No problem. All right. Since we don't have any questions and this is a brief, these are brief survey set, I think we should move on to our next presentation. So I'd like to introduce John Battles, who's joined us from UC Berkeley, also serves on our science advisory panel. It's going to be going over the context of context of core metrics in regional resource kits. So go ahead, John.
All right. Thanks, Guy. Just get my talk loud up here. All right. Does it look good, Sky, on your end?
Good, John. Thanks.
Great. All right. Yeah, so hi, I'm John Battles. I'm a forest ecologist at UC Berkeley, and we're going to give an overview of the regional resource kit. I consider this in a nerdy science way as our information infrastructure, but for good reasons, we call it the regional resource kit. It's important. All of this work comes from the Science Advisory Panel. I serve as co-chair along with my dear colleague, Steve Ostoya from the USDA Climate Hub. And the main role of the Science Advisory Panel within the task force structure is to provide the best available science to inform stewardship now and into the future. And so a lot of the resource kit aspects have been intersecting with this role. And indeed, from the very first launch, one of the main priorities from the Science Advisory Panel, the big pieces of advice, was to pull information together and make it available so it can inform both planning and policy and management. And so we're going to overview what we've been doing in that regard. This is the regional resource kits, is what we call them. They cover the entire state, although there are some exceptions. We don't have any sort of insights. We exclude the irrigated agriculture in the Central Valley. And while we include the WUI areas, we do not include the urban cores from this assessment, from this development of the metrics. I also note that within the sort of the desert regions in the southeastern part of the state, that we have more limited insights into some of the metrics, and so we have limited mapping in the desert region. And those are more of a factor of what information we have available. Again, you put scientists in charge. We're going to start off with this wheel, this regional resource kit, and we start right at the beginning with a theoretical framing of pillars of resilience. This gives the overall framework of how we're going to organize these complex landscapes and figure out what we need to measure, where it goes, what aspect of these complex landscapes it influences, and how we organize. So it's both a theoretical framing to meet the multiple goals and also an organizational tool. One of the core things we've been doing is pulling metrics together, and we'll talk more about that. These are basically data layers that inform management and policy. With those metrics, we can do assessments and priorities region by region. These are what we call our regional profiles. Along the way, we've been building decision support software that allows everybody from local community groups to state agencies and federal agencies to use this information and use it in an effective way to plan. As Forrest mentioned, we've helped the interagency task force has built a project tracking inventory, so we know where treatments are, and those can be directly input into this. And then importantly, we have to have a monitoring and evaluation system, right? And so we presented this, we've showed this circle. This is how we think about the regional resource kits. But of course, when we present this, we're not showing the connections in this. And at one point, when we were giving this to the task force leadership, the regional forester and the secretary told us to connect the dots. And so this is how the dots are connecting. On the left, in these boxes, you basically have the data. We have the interagency tracking system, so we know where the treatments are going. We have all these regional metrics. We also have information from remote sensing. And we also have, again, we're trying to incorporate sort of on-the-ground field data as well. That all funnels into the Wildfire Landscape Resilience Data Hub. All the information gets collated, gets consolidated, and then it gets served out to all the different functions that we need. So for example, we're serving it out to the million-acre scenario. That's a planning modeling scenario that the task force is doing. It serves into Planscape, which is the decision support software. Both of these sources of information go into treatment plans and help accelerate getting that million-acre goal. Where should they go? Where do we get the best bang for the buck? Help local communities plan that. And then these treatment plans, then we got to figure out what's their impact. And that's where we are today. How do we take what we do on the landscape and convert it to impact and reporting? And therefore, although these metrics that we're developing in this information infrastructure it has to serve both purposes, you have different parts of it that serve those purposes going forward. And so we'll start off, go one by one. Here's the pillars of resilience. This really grew out of Pat Manley's work and her colleagues in the Tahoe area. It's a really strong foundation to base our information on. It divides the key parts of the landscape into sort of 10 pillars. These would be the typical services and benefits we get from our natural resources. Some of these are quite broad, so we more finely divide them into certain elements of these pillars. And then for each one of the elements, we try and put metrics that inform them. Now, the metrics can inform several different elements and several different pillars, but for organizational purposes, we kind of sit them into one of these pillar element frameworks. So it's a powerful way of organizing our information that also helps us reflect what we think is the complexity and the multiple demands we have on our landscapes out there. The metric. So this has been sort of, from day one, we've always known that we got to pull our information together, get it in one place. And what do these look like? Typically for the regional resource kits, we've decided our goal is to have 30-meter resolution on all of that in a raster format. Ideally, we have these metrics statewide, but we include one specific to particular regions. And we want to have, ideally, again, sort of annual information, metrics that can be updated annually. And this is just an example of the kind of information. Not every piece of information fits those criteria. For example, this is up in the Northern California region. We identify critical salmon habitat. That's super important for that region. So we identify where those those habitats are and for which species of salmon they're important for. One that we have for the whole state is the probability of high severity fire here in the middle. And we have, again, estimates of what the risk of this high fire risk is throughout the state. And then, of course, we have other aspects as well. In this case, we have total carbon storage across the state, again, in these 30-meter rasters. These are the foundations, these measurements that we use to make management plans and to inform policy. And again, these are at 30-meter resolution, and ideally, we have them across the state. When we assemble this information together, we're able to do assessments and set priorities. And here's an example, again, from the North Coast, where we were trying to demonstrate the power of the resource kits. So underlaying this, we have the probability of high severity fire. And then we took the interagency tracking system to identify where we had some recent treatments. I believe these are 2022 treatments that got done in two different sort of areas in Northern California, one near Scotts Valley and on the right here in Weaverville. And this is exactly what local communities can use to plan. Where should we put our next set of treatments as we work to sort of protect our communities and protect our landscapes? And you can see that, there's a strategy. You can see where they've done some work with some existing treatments. Here on the red, these are prescribed fires, and the purple is more mechanical thinning. And so you can see both Scotts Valley and Weaverville are trying to protect their communities, trying to protect, these are high fire risk areas. But you can also see differences, some of this local control, where if you look at Weaverville, they've invested more in mechanical treatments, where in Scotts Valley, they've relied more on beneficial fire. And that's kind of the strategy here, where the information is provided, there's some overall goals set from federal and state policy, but there's a lot of, sort of local and regional sort of decision-making of how they make their trade-offs going forward. And that's one of the reasons why we want to make all of this information both easy to find and easy to use. So we can inform, again, from local community groups to state and federal decision makers. Really important part that came out of the Science Advisory Panel was to pull these informations together. We have these regional profiles. They provide a primer of what these regions look like, what their ecology and conservation goals are. They demonstrate the use of these metrics, so how you can do assessments. And importantly, we included surveys with regional stakeholders to document what the local regions thought were important. In terms of what they wanted to do to protect their communities and protect their landscapes. And so I always think of these as primers and demonstrations and useful resources for the regions to go forward. Again, vital parts of demonstrating. It pulls all the information together, and it also gets people on the same page. The Google Fellows Program launched a partnership with the California Natural Resources Department to bring this technology of decision support and from Google's expertise to make a decision support software. And that's evolved into the Planscape Cooperative. This is a place where all of the regional resource kit metrics get fed in there, and you can both use them to explore and assess your landscapes, and in the future, start planning and hopefully evaluating impacts going forward. So this is a going concern. It's ongoing right now. The explore function, you can explore all of the resources across for all the regions in the state in sort of 4-panel splendor. And as well, just recently, January 18th, they launched their planning function for the Sierra Nevada region. And here's a QR code if you want to look at that. This is all available through the task force and also on the Planscape website. Again, this is a going concern. It's got additional funding to keep it going, to develop the decision support system going forward. Again, to make this information useful, and in this case, from a planning perspective. As Forrest mentioned, there's also been great progress in delivering the interagency tracking system, where all the information gets pulled together, where the recent and hopefully planned treatments will be done, and so people can see where work has been done, where it's going, because we know that a lot of the challenges we face are landscape based. That it depends on what your neighbor is doing, and it makes it, you need to know what it's going, so it informs management and planning. Importantly, this is the value of this is already paying off from my perspective. I had a grad student ask me, how much prescribed fire was done in California last year, and then typically in the past that would be kind of a tedious research project to go through, the Forest Service's database and Cal Fire's database and maybe the National Park Service's database and pull that all together, and it'd be a couple of day exercise. And she was able to answer it. I just pointed her to the dashboard, and she got it like in 2 minutes. It was great. It's a super useful, valuable tool to have. And again, it's the first thing. We need to know how much treatment we're doing, and now we need to go and assess that impact. So this is access. All of these things are up and running. We have phase 1 complete. We have a first iteration for all of the regions. By the first quarter of this year, they'll be all updated and made consistent. And again, all this is available through the website, through the task force website. You can go and get it. But now we have a problem. Our problem is that we have too many metrics. That, in the Sierra Nevada, we list 79 metrics, Northern California, 100 metrics, Central Coast, 82 metrics, and for Southern California, 89 metrics. Again, we put them in there because our initial goal, our initial priority was to inform planning. So communities could get their treatments on the ground, money could get allocated, and the plans could go out there. So we really focused on planning. And what we learned from talking to our stakeholders in these different regions is they wanted a full palette to decide how to inform their treatments. And that makes a lot of sense. And by my count, there's like 150 sort of distinct metrics throughout the state. And that's just a lot to maintain. And also not all of these metrics are equally good for planning as for impact reporting. So we have this problem. Now, I just want to take a pause here and say, yeah, it's a problem. We have too much information, right? And this information is available right now on a website, and you can go and download sort of the raw data with all of the details and put it into your GIS systems and your planning systems and use. Or you can go to Planscape, and again, you can explore it with a really nice browser and just a click of a mouse button to find all of this information. And from both of those sources, you can go and click and get access to a detailed data dictionary that for every one of these metrics, and it describes in 2 to 3 pages, what it does, where it came from, and how it was built. And so we have all that information that informs that. You can also go to the regional profiles, again, to get an update and a primer and see how this stuff has worked. You can go to, so we have a lot of information going forward, which is a lot of work. A lot of scientists share their data, share their expertise, share their time to sort of compile this together. And at the same time, we're also harvesting really some thoughtful and forward-thinking investments in research and development from the Forest Service and the state of California. So in other words, it's a really good problem to have too much information and be able to narrow it down and figure which one of these metrics go to our next priority, which is the reporting aspect and measuring impact of all this work. Another problem is that it's not feasible to use all this information efficiently in all the different kinds of applications, nor is it practical that we can actually maintain and update and keep current this many metrics. So we really, from both a practical side and an operational side, we need to sort of narrow it down to core metrics that, again, we can inform our priorities from both for this essential part of reporting and impact assessment. So what are we going to do? So this is going to be handing this off later on to MV, is that we need to identify a subset that measures success, are interpretable, and address the resilience goals going forward. I'm happy to answer any questions, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, John. So we do have some questions, so I'll turn that over to Jen, and then also just let everyone know to go to survey set number 3. Please fill out survey set number 3, and Jennifer can take the questions.
Great. And some of these questions may be ones that others of the task force staff can chime in on as well, but John, I'll pose them to you first. So first question, is there any inclusion, I think the writer meant in the metric kits of the California fine scale vegetation mapping data?
I guess I'm not sure what fine scale means. We certainly have to include sort of the FVeg, sort of the compiled vegetation map. And then in some cases, we've done what, one of the problems is that some of that was a bit old in terms that it was mapped in the 2000s, and there's been 2 or 3 fires on that landscape since it was last mapped. And so we tried to update that, but it was a very much a sort of a get it done. We call it the Franken-Veg. And so, no, I think that's one, and I think that the sort of the interagency science team that pulled these metrics together, we identified fine scale, up-to-date vegetation data as our probably #1 wish list from a biophysical perspective.
Thanks, John. This next question, Forrest or Nick, please maybe chime in as well. Will the use of Planscape be required for future project funding at a state or federal level?
Oh, yeah, it's definitely for Forrest or Nick.
No, the intent is not to have it be required, but to help support future planning efforts by folks. So it's going to be able to be used to help provide that context and help facilitate that process, but it's never not intended to be required to be used. There are multiple other platforms that are available, multiple other pathways to apply for grants and funding, and those will remain open.
Thanks,
Just that
Nick.
Planscape is the public open science, open data option.
And will any of the user entered data that is brought into Planscape be tied with the statewide metric layers?
That's a great question. That's I think in terms of functionality in Planscape, that's also a priority wish list, is that we could take the sort of the statewide or the compile metrics from the resource kits and then allow users to bring in their own data and mesh that. And so they can bring in their own data. So they don't have to share. Again, everything that goes into the regional resource kits are open and free to all users. And so sometimes that's a great ethic to have, but sometimes local groups have data that needs to be private. For example, on Forest Service on public lands, oftentimes you don't want to show where the endangered species pack lives, or you're an indigenous community doesn't want to share its culturally relevant information or make it public. Right. And so, but that's tricky from a software perspective, and that's clearly on sort of the priority list of developing it, because it comes up all the time, and we've been trying to build it that way. But that's a goal, but it doesn't exist just yet. You can bring in your own shape files, but any kind of merging is going to happen after the fact right now. Because one of the things we're doing is the Planscape is doing is they're working with the Upper McCullough River Watershed Association to do their planning. They have a 250,000 acre planning process. And they're using Planscape to see how it works, but oftentimes they're having to go and build stuff out and kind of merge it together. So this help that they're doing with the Upper McCullough is both learning how people train, kind of get people to use the Planscape, but also see where the weaknesses are and what we need to do in the future.
Thanks, John. This next question is another that John or Nick, you might both have something to say. One of the biggest challenges for implementing a project is the requirements from multiple state agencies, some of which may conflict with each other, or with the goal of reducing vegetative fuels. Has the task force considered convening the state agencies to agree on a standard vehicle for analysis, such as the CalVTP project-specific analysis?
I'm going to punt that to you, Nick.
It's an excellent question, and it's one of the goals with regards to the effort today and our continuing effort for these core reporting metrics and for the RRKs in general is to identify places where we can align, where we can have a single process, but that may not be possible for all things. So we also want to identify where there are places where you may need 2 different efforts or 2 different processes. Be clear about where and how those apply and why they're important. So we don't want to necessarily funnel everything and make people follow a certain pathway, knowing that different departments, different agencies, organizations, they all have their own requirements, their own stakeholders and decision makers that they report to. But we are working together, and I want to thank all of our fellow agencies and other folks that are part of the task force who are helping to have that conversation, because it's not always the most it's not always the easiest conversation to have. So good question, and that's certainly part of our goal.
Great. The next question is asking if the intention is to have the same metrics, I'm assuming this person means core metrics, used for all steps of the adaptive management cycle, from planning to prioritization to implementation to assessment and verification.
My understanding, and I'll leave it to Nick, is that for the planning purposes, we want a full palette, but for the impact and reporting, we need to have a core set. You know, that's been the charge to the Science Advisory Panel, is to evaluate these full list of metrics in terms of their ability, their sensitivity, their interpretability, and their feasibility to do reporting and impacts. And so that was the charge that we got from the task force.
Next question, and Sky, please just jump in if we're coming up to the time we need to move on. Since most, if not all, of the metric data are remote and or modeled, is there a plan to ground check any of it with post-treatment collected data?
I'm not from the Science Advisory Panel's perspective, but I do know that CAL FIRE FRAP is evaluating pre and post for prescribed fire. There's certainly a lot of field research. If you noted in our connecting the dots, the diagram, that we had California field data, and that's exactly why that's important, is to do this validation of the model and remote sensing. But honestly, that's, again, if you think about it, anybody who collects field data, you know how tricky that is to synthesize across different researchers in different places. And that's clearly a priority, one of the tasks that the Data Hub has to do, but it's coming. But it's really acknowledged that's absolutely essential, and that's what we're trying to do.
And going back briefly, John, I was trying to remember offhand, but I can't. The person you asked earlier about the fine scale vegetation mapping was referencing the Tuckman Geospatial group that created that for East Bay Regional Parks, and that in that
Right.
area. My recollection is that that would be very region specific data, and I'm not sure if it made it into the Central Coast resource kit or metric kit. Do you remember?
If it was done, again, I think again, FVEG is a compilation that I believe, that pulls together all of the available veg map that follows to the national classification system, which is what this kind of work did. And I know at the time, especially for the sort of the Central Coast, that up in the sort of North Bay area and East Bay area, that there's a huge ongoing effort to update the maps. But I'm not sure they were done yet. We also only included stuff that was ready to go and done. And so if it wasn't incorporated into FVEG, it might not be there. And then that's the other part, that regional resource kits are an ongoing effort. And one of the key challenges we have in phase 2 is to keep things updated. And when new information comes out, when it's coming out really fast, because of the investment, the research investments, they need to be updated as fast as possible. Because, again, the veg data is fundamental to a lot of what happens in our case.
Right. Thanks, John. That was my memory too, is that was an ongoing effort when that region's metric kit was being curated. I think perhaps our last question is asking about the status of efforts to establish programmatic statewide LiDAR collections, in recognition that would be such a powerful tool for understanding the landscape and measuring change.
Yeah,
that might be a Nick.
Yeah, I just got asked by colleagues at the Region 5 what the plan was, and I had to punt it. So I think it is. I don't know what the current plan is.
Yeah, I know that there are conversations happening at CNRA and Forest Service and other agencies that are working across the state. To my knowledge, there hasn't been an agreed upon path forward, although there is coverage almost entirely across the state from various collections of LiDAR data that's available. And that certainly would provide us with more detailed information, but the work that we're dealing with today is based off of what we have at the moment, and we will continue to try to build and maintain and update data sets in the RRKs moving forward with the best available data that's there.
Great. Thank you both. I think that's all the questions we have that directly pertain to John's presentation so far. So Sky, I will turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you, John. So please finish up those survey questions for survey set 3 if you didn't get a chance. And we will be now transitioning over to Patricia Manley from the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Southwest Research Station to talk about the national efforts. So go ahead. Thanks.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Sorry about that little technical difficulty. I sorted it out though. So, yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit about a larger scale application and essentially an outgrowth really of the work that California and the task force in collaboration with the Forest Service and others have been pursuing across the entire state. And then really at a parallel time frame, you know, that these crises that we're facing here in California are certainly also playing out across the West. And so the Forest Service has also issued a similar strategy, the wildfire crisis strategy. It's now entering into its 3rd year. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our response to that. Again, bringing and leveraging much of the great work and foundations that were built here in California, as well as with our partners in the Rocky Mountain Research Station, looking at how we can evaluate condition and risk in a meaningful way. So I want to recognize my colleagues in this effort, Nick Povak here in the Pacific Southwest Research Station, and then Mark Finney and Greg Dillon in the Rocky Mountain Research Station. Just a quick background in terms of the wildfire crisis strategy itself. It has kind of a 2-pronged approach. One is to really dedicate funds to help increase the pace and scale of activities on the landscape that will reduce the risk of wildfire and also improve landscape conditions for future, both in terms of climate and climate-driven fire across the landscape. It's an all lands approach. It's a 10-year strategy. And like I say, we're entering into the 3rd year of that strategy at a national level. In terms of what does that play out in terms of actual activities, there were over the course of 2 years, 21 landscapes have been identified across the West. And you can see these polygons here in various colors represent those 21 landscapes. They are identified as the most at risk and or the highest priority for a variety of reasons that cover nearly 50 million acres. The individual landscapes vary from 250,000 to over 10 million acres. So they're really variable in size. But all of them have obviously a variety of communities within them, watersheds and other infrastructure as like power lines that are listed here as important focal areas for overall risk reduction and then the landscapes themselves in terms of improving their condition. In addition to that very primary driver of fire, there are a couple of other important facets that drove the selection of these landscapes, especially they were kind of done in 2 batches, and a second batch of landscapes had even a broader array of objectives. One has to do with the mature and old growth forest strategy, conservation efforts that are that the agency Forest Service is in collaboration with other federal agencies launching the strategy to recognize the importance of old forests and large trees and the functions they play in these landscapes and the risk that they're at or the threat that fire and other climate-driven disturbances pose to these important functions. So this enters into the metrics, as you'll see, in terms of what we might be representing and why. A second is the municipal watersheds, or actually water availability. Clearly, that's a essential ecosystem service and something that we want to make sure that we maintain and or enhance through treatments across these landscapes. the Forest Service over the last 10 years has developed this important focus and additional data and ability to address these in a more meaningful way over time in this Forest to Faucets program. And so the idea to, or the degree to which watersheds provide municipal water and to what sort of size of population is certainly a consideration as well in terms of where and how treatments are implemented across the landscape. As Forrest pointed out so well in the beginning of this workshop, we can and do quantify our actions on these landscapes in terms of acres treated, the partnerships that have been put into place and enhanced over time in order to make these treatments possible. But we're all needing and wanting to go beyond that. These numbers matter, and we're really expanding our ability to speak to what does it take to get the job done and how well are we doing it. So with that, we really turn our attention to these outcome metrics. The wildfire crisis strategy, as I mentioned, is entering into its third year. Our objective, my colleagues and I are working to leverage the great work that's been done both in Rocky Mountain here in California to bring a meaningful set of metrics to describe, at least over the first few years of this strategy, what has been accomplished and what does it mean. So as John, I think, pointed out really well in terms of the regional resource kits, the same sort of criteria are still highly relevant and applicable to these 21 landscapes across the entire Western US. They have to be wall-to-wall data, meaning 30-meter resolution that are available to all of the landscapes, and ideally not just the WCS landscapes, as I'll use for short in terms of the wildfire crisis strategy, but also across all lands. So the goal here is to move toward not just serving the needs of these landscapes, but any landscape, and being able to address all lands at any scale. So that's really, we look for data that can accomplish that, that's scientifically robust, and that provides a representation that both tells us something important about the resilience of these systems, but also is intuitive and meaningful to people, agencies, managers, et cetera. Many of these data sets that we drew on were also the same data sets that we've drawn on for the regional resource kits. So there's quite a bit of overlap there. In some cases, California or smaller scale regions, as were pointed out in the Q&A, have additional data sets that have even more resolution to them. At this west-wide scale, we are limited to those data sets that are available across that entire area. We are, as John pointed out, for the regional resource kits, also leveraging the framework for resilience in these 10 pillars to sort of address these conditions, both within each of these categories of resource areas, as well as across them in terms of overall landscape condition and resilience. I won't spend much time on this because John did a great job of covering these, but essentially they're really intuitive and useful and also scientifically meaningful. And so we found that they're going to serve this broader scale need as well as they have in California. This pipeline, I wanted to spend a little bit of time on this. A lot of discussion already about how we take information and move it through its paces to be able to say something about risk, condition, progress, benefits. So quickly on the left are the 10 pillars in terms of various resources representing our values across the socio-ecological spectrum. The next column of boxes, the current condition box, is really helping us sort of translate these raw data values into something meaningful that we can interpret. So risks, what are the risks to assets, meaning infrastructure, houses, power lines, et cetera? What are the risks that we're seeing in terms of resources that really can't recover in a reasonable time, and sometimes, in some cases, can't recover ever? What are our conditions of these resources? So in terms of overall resilience, and then what's the climate vulnerability at this point in time? So based on our understanding of how climate's going to change over the next few decades and longer, where are those areas where we might have the greatest concern about the ability to maintain conditions that are important for providing quality of life, ecosystem services, and resilience? So those are ways we sort of translate the current information into an understanding, in other words, of where we are in terms of status. The management need, I'm not going to spend much time there because that's really more of a planning function where you can use the same information to help identify where management can make a difference. That's really that planning function that John mentioned. I'm going to move over to that green column of treatments. And really this whole workshop is really focused on that top box. What actions have been completed? What are the values that have come from that? What are the benefits? And how far are we moving? How quickly are we moving? And how close are we getting to these desired outcomes? That final column on the right are the outcomes. We've been working on sort of compartmentalizing those into these 4 categories of to what degree has risk been reduced? To what degree have conditions been improved? How do those 2 things together add up into an overall resilience of the landscape, progress toward those outcomes of a resilient landscape? And to what degree, again, have those investments and those changes made our landscapes more climate adapted? So those are our objectives that I think we're applying across these scales, both across California and across these WCS landscapes across the West, and ultimately across any landscape, if we get it right or we do it well. So we have a very near-term goal of providing a first iteration of these core metrics, and the progress has been made for the last couple of years of investment for the wildfire crisis strategy. So that's what this central column, this March column of metrics you'll see here. It doesn't represent all of the pillars yet. We have just a relatively short period of time. So we focused on those that we thought were the most meaningful, the most sort of direct objectives of these forest and landscape treatments that are being implemented in the wildfire crisis strategy landscapes, and then filling in over the course of the year with some additional metrics in that far right column. And these are ones, again, that draw on data that are available across the West, that are meaningful and robust data that we know we can trust, and then working with California and other states as well to sort of shape these additional metrics in the composite set so they're really as meaningful as possible to every landscape across this whole large geographic area, and consistent with how each of the states, and California in particular, are interested in and need to represent their progress toward desired outcomes. So I'm just going to dive into 2 things really quickly. One is I talked about risk, and I talked about condition, and talked about climate. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on each of those to provide a bit more detail. So when we talk about risk, and this is work from the Rocky Mountain Research Station, Mark Finney and Greg Dillon, as I mentioned, they identified 3 main inputs or factors that get rolled into risk. One is the likelihood of an event occurring. And there are a variety of ones when it comes to fire. One can to look at in terms of what's that likelihood. Ignition, probability of ignition is one, for example, of the likelihood of a fire. And then if a fire actually did occur, how would it burn? What's the intensity or expected intensity? And that's a function of the condition of a given location if fire were to occur there. And then the third function is how susceptible is a given asset or a given resource or a given component of the landscape if it experienced that intensity of fire, and that's the susceptibility function. So they've developed this really, I think, robust and useful methodology for quantifying risk. And then you can apply this to basically any aspect of the landscape of interest. Certainly assets, infrastructure, homes, et cetera, are a primary focus, but not the only focus. And so this sort of stack of resources you see at the bottom right can really be represented, or you can include a whole variety of resources in that, and you'll see that we have done that, or working together toward that. The second aspect that I talked about was condition. So I think in California and again across these WCS landscapes across the West, it's really a 2-parted equation. Risk is very important, but overall condition and outcome is important as well, and they really work together. So how are we quantifying condition? Well, this is a function of exactly how we did it in the regional resource kits, is take these raw data, that far left-hand column of that pipeline. And in here, we just have a single example metric in terms of the raw tree count that varies from 0 to 23 trees per acre. That in and of itself isn't necessarily a meaningful measure. It's not directly intuitively obvious what might be a good number or a number to be concerned about. So we translate that into an interpretation of condition. And that interpretation is based on our understanding resilience from published literature and looking at how these systems respond to disturbance over time and or how they, including fire, but also climate change. So it's this translation to a condition score, in this case, that varies from -1 to +1, that really helps us take a number and make sense of it. And that's what we've done in the regional resource kits and are bringing that same methodology and interpretation to all of the WCS landscapes across the West. Now, this -1 to +1 is very useful for evaluating and quantifying and bringing multiple metrics together and seeing how they change over time, because it puts them on a standardized scale. But in terms of reporting, it can be a little bit confusing, and not everyone might be familiar with that. So you can also easily convert these to a 0 to 100%, where a value of +1 is meeting 100% of your desired condition. That is a mission accomplished in a sense. And a -1 is really sort of not having any of that desired condition really represented in whatever the state of that system is in that moment. So we can convert this, and this is our intention, is to sort of work with that and see how that works for this first iteration of the wildfire crisis strategy summaries. This is just an example of what this looks like. If we say, like, well, how do we convert actual values into this representation of condition, and how might we do that across a landscape? These are planning areas within a fireshed or across a WCS landscape, I should say. This is the Klamath Wildfire Crisis Strategy landscape. And these polygons are 25,000 acre planning areas that are standard sub-fireshed boundaries. And so we've developed this, this is just a representation of what that might look like. So calculating what the stand density index, which in and of itself may not be terribly intuitive to a lot of folks, and bringing that into this language, which is longstanding language as well in terms of forestry, how one interprets those, and then bringing those into a visual representation across the landscape to make them more accessible and intuitive for users and planners and decision makers. The third category I wanted to just jump into a little bit that I mentioned earlier is climate. So we talked about climate adaptation. Again, this is a methodology that we developed on behalf of the task force and the action plan in the regional resource kits. They are incorporated into the regional resource kits, are these representations of climate vulnerability based on analog modeling. So to what degree do we expect climate to be changing over the next mid-century is what this representation is. So 2050, 2060, a few decades into the future. And for each and every pillar, what about that climate change might create either a problem or not create a problem for the persistence of these conditions, or resilient conditions as we see them today. So these 6 pillars are representation of an interpretation of climate change for each and every pillar. And so you'll see that these are at a 30-meter resolution. If it's a blue color, it means that climate does probably not pose a major constraint or stress on that condition. The red color means it's likely that climate will be a significant constraint or stress on that resource into the future. And you can see some consistency across these pillars, but there's a lot of variability. So this gives us the ability to sort of look at, well, how is that changing over time? How are these conditions becoming more or less climate adapted over time? And finally, there's this, how do we deliver this information? And so this is just an example of how we're thinking about doing that. Different roll-ups of information have different value for different audiences and or are more interpretable than others. So a couple of different representations here. These maps provide a color ramp and a spatial distribution that hopefully are pretty intuitive in terms of the degree to which conditions are changing. This is actually the Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative landscape, so a real landscape. In this case, the units that are colored are not those planning areas. In this case, they're potential operational delineations, or pods. You can also use HUC 12 watersheds. So there's a variety of different units one can use to sort of color up a landscape to understand where these changes are happening and to what degree. And then on the right is the scorecard, where it puts things in a numerical context, reports out on each individual pillar. And then at the bottom provides an overall landscape resilience representation. And in that 0 to 100% format that hopefully is pretty intuitive for folks, and the folks are familiar with, in terms of the absolute percent toward those desired conditions that are represented in that positive one translation that we talked about earlier. So I think this is my last slide. And I'm happy to take questions or comments, and I'll turn it back over to Sky.
Thank you so much, Pat. So we can go into questions. We have a few, and please open up survey set number 4 now. So please fill that out, and we've got about 5 minutes now for Q&A. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Thanks, Guy. Thanks, Pat. So first question is asking whether the forest to faucet data are incorporated in metrics for each region. And Pat, I was hoping maybe you could speak to if forest to faucet data are in the regional resource kits, as well as whether they're being considered for the wildfire crisis strategy metrics.
They are not yet in the regional resource kits. They were kind of under a significant revision and expansion when we were building the regional resource kits. They're absolutely publicly available, but they're not sort of directly embedded into the regional resource kits at the moment.
Thanks, Pat. Next question is asking about the quantitative wildfire risk assessment likelihood. And the question is whether the likelihood includes the probability of ignition or is based solely on weather and fuels.
It incorporates the probability of ignition, yeah. And there's a great literature on that that anyone can delve into. It's also I think the intention is to bring that to all of California. So we're sort of working together toward that outcome over the course of this coming year. So I think folks will hear and learn more about that over the coming months. Awesome.
And then the last question, I'm not entirely sure if they are referencing the core metrics or something else, but this question is whether managed wildfire, as in wildfire managed for resource benefit, is included in the tracking, and whether the U.S. Forest Service tracks that information.
Yes, so the wildfires are tracked. This is this is part of what this effort, just like in California, the interagency treatment tracking system is, I'd say, a novel and a really forward-looking, I think, tool that doesn't really exist across the whole West. So we've had to go back to some of the individual parts and pieces that tracking system really drew from and recreate that, not as well. We didn't have as much time, but essentially looking at different sources of tracking to be able to understand how wildfire and mechanical treatment, prescribed fire, all these different sources of change, the degree to which they are contributing to change. So we have kind of a big bucket source of change, and then we're trying to differentiate those between intentional or managed fire, wildfire, and intentional mechanical treatment and prescribed fire.
Great, thanks, Pat. That's all the questions we have right now, Sky, so I'll turn it back over to you. Oh, I'm just kidding. There's one that just came in. Sorry. If we have time, Sky, I'll pose this.
Yeah, we can make this the last question.
Okay, great. So this question is recognizing that fuel maps from Landfire have a temporal resolution of 2 years, and they're wondering how you're managing to develop likelihood annually using them.
I think you're thinking about the likelihood of ignition. Is this still about fire likelihood? I'll just say in general, we have to work with those those temporal increments of land fire, especially at this large landscape scale. So attributing change to an individual year is pretty challenging, and we're not able to do that. We're also not, we're sort of, for this wildfire crisis strategy evaluation, we're doing a block of time. So we're doing a 2 or 3 year block of time. You can certainly use other tools like FVS to kind of break that out a little bit if you know the year of treatment, and you can actually bring growth and non-treated areas along through that treatment process, or the recovery. If you're looking at 3 or 4 or 5 years and a treatment happened in year 1, can use tools like FBS and other forest growth models to sort of bring that forward to see, like, well, where are we today? And that's relatively commonly done at the project scale for an evaluation or to anticipate treatment benefits. We're bringing all of those tools and methodologies to more of this tracking over time system, but that's definitely a work in progress.
Thanks, Pat. Back to you, Sky.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Pat, for providing that national perspective. And we're going to turn now to MV. MV is going to cover core reporting metrics, criteria, and how do we select these and what's most important selection. So MV Eitzel from the Science Advisory Panel in UC Berkeley, please go ahead and run us through criteria.
Thanks, Sky. Yeah, so I'm gonna run you through some of the details of not too many gory details, but some background on where this list that you're about to see that Nick's going to share after me, where this came from. So to just sort of call back to John, again, we have this really kind of good problem to have. We have a lot of metrics. They're really rich for planning, but then when we take all of these metrics and we end up with sort of a large number of them, and we need to propagate them through all of these different uses, it's going to become unwieldy. And so again, the whole point is to try to come down to a subset that we can use to propagate into things like monitoring and reporting. So the process that we've gone through so far to develop a subset like that, we started with the Science Advisory Panel. So the Science Advisory Panel, we looked at the Regional Resource Kit metrics, so all of those numbers of metrics that I sort of just showed a minute ago. We reviewed some criteria that might be a good way to look at what would make a good core metric, which I'm going to go over in some detail with the rest of the presentation. We considered anything that was missing, and again, you've heard some of those things were just not quite ready when they put the regional resource kits out. Some of them are known gaps that we know are important to measure but hard to measure. So we sort of gave some thought to that. We actually worked with the task force staff to come up with some more specific resilience goals, so that we're not just saying what makes a good core reporting metric or what makes a good metric for, like, what's most important. Well, for what purpose? What is the goal you're trying to manage for? What is the outcome you're trying to ensure? And so we were then able to develop these specific goals. And then we had the Science Advisory Panel rate each of the metrics that we had in the Regional Resource Kit based on each of those goals. And we used a survey much like you're going to see will be sent out later on in some of the later question survey that you're seeing today. We also received the guidance because you can imagine that a set of core metrics, a set that were sort of the key things you wanted to measure could really depend on what you were using it for, could really change what the metrics you want to be, what you want them to be. So that means that when we spoke with the task force staff, we were getting this direction that we're right now really interested in getting beyond acres treated and talking about what we can report. And so we have all of that focus. And then the Science Advisory Panel staff, we summarized the results of all of that work for the task force. And then the task force has taken that input and as well as other considerations, and they've come up with a draft proposal of possible core metrics to use. So they have an example set to share. We've then also been collectively as a group getting feedback from agencies and partners. So the task force has been convening a variety of different groups to review that example set of metrics. They've been very careful to think about alignment with other reporting processes. The most obvious example coming from Pat just now, that there's this wildfire crisis strategy but there's other processes also that are going on about coming up with core reporting metrics. So we're making sure things are aligned. And then here we are having a public workshop on this initial list. So you are here. We have now arrived at now. And then what's going to be happening next, the next steps are going to be that the task force is updating their action plan. They're going to share this survey with you that will give you a little bit more time to think through the metrics that they're proposing and to give alternatives and feedback on that. So you don't have to try to do that in real time in a Zoom webinar. They're going to iterate on the results of that and get additional feedback. And then that final set that they come up with is what's going to go into the action plan update. What I'm now going to do is I'm just going to make it clear, first of all, what resilience goals we sort of collectively are working with here. So I'll take a moment to tell you about that. What we did here with both the Science Advisory Panel ratings and then also to some degree with how we've been thinking about this, we grouped the pillars in sort of a broad way. So rather than getting specific about air or water or vegetation, we came up with 3 broad overlapping goals that things could possibly fall into more than one of these goals. So the first one is we're trying to reduce wildfire risk to communities sort of in the short term, sort of safety concerns. We're also interested in longer term ecological integrity. And so there can be, some choices you make in the present that you want to make sure will still serve you in the future. And we're also interested in social, cultural, and economic well-being. So we're also interested in human interactions with these environments and landscapes. And so you can imagine both things you might track and specific metrics doing that tracking that might fall into more than one of these 3 broad groups. So that's the goals that we rated these metrics from the Science Advisory Panel. Now I'm going to go ahead and dive into the criteria. And the first thing I want to share is the process we used to come up with the criteria, which is that briefly, we definitely checked processes that have already been done. There's processes like the National Park Service's Vital Signs Program and the Montreal process, which are ways that people use to come up with like a subset of metrics that you want to report on. And so that's one thing that we evaluated looking at those. We then also discussed what we came up with the Science Advisory Panel and other experts. Then the task force staff identified some additional factors, and then this whole set that you're going to see, and there's going to be 9 of them. This all went into a discussion with various agency staff and partners with all the various groups the task force has been convening around this topic. So now what I'm going to do is go through each of the 9 criteria. And the thing to keep in mind here is that, the task force is going to do their best to pick metrics that, can meet all of these criteria, but there may be times where that's not possible, or there's specific reasons that we need to choose maybe a different strategy. But the idea is to be mindful about what it means if something doesn't meet one of these criteria, rather than just sort of picking what we have. And we'll think about what we could get that could be better if we have that opportunity. So the first criterion is to be focused on reporting rather than planning. And this question came up earlier. There are definitely metrics that can be used for both. And in fact, in an adaptive management sort of strategy where you measure something, you then, the measurement tells you where to do the thing, which is the prioritizing or planning. And then, you see how you then measure it again to see how you did. So that's how you then report. And then that feeds back into what you're going to measure next time. But there are some variables or some metrics that maybe don't really work in both contexts. So we've been sort of pointing towards reporting. The example I'm going to give you, and what I'm going to do with each of these criterion is to give you an example from the actual metrics that we've been evaluating. So you can kind of ground that in what we've been doing. So in this case, something that's going to be useful for planning might be the locations of low-income communities, because that might help direct you to do treatments in particular places, maybe to benefit the communities, to help them with safety, or to create jobs, or maybe to not do it nearby if you're worried about the health impact. So there's reasons why the locations could be really important for planning, but then that might not translate to benefits. And so measuring the actual jobs created, and particularly in those locations, might be a better way of getting at whether or not you have actually, to report on how you've what you've accomplished on that side of things. So that's the first one. We would like for these to be applicable statewide. You heard Pat talk about how they're required to have things to be wall to wall everywhere across the West. We'd like to be able to do that here. Where possible, that means avoiding ecosystem-specific choices. So for example, large tree carbon is only appropriate where you have large trees or ecosystems where there are large trees. And so, if you focus on a metric like that, then you may be leaving out whole parts of the state. That may not be possible all the time. Those are still important metrics, but we just want to be mindful of what that does when we think about reporting. In addition, and again, this is coming back to the regional resource kits that, we have in some cases, some of these metrics that are for one region. So stand density index is one that was calculated for just the Sierras, but could be extended to other places that have forests. So we want to think about, where we can to push to be statewide would be great. We want to make sure that these are feasible to be measured again. So again, if we're heading towards wanting to be able to do sort of evaluation and monitoring kind of strategies, we need to remeasure them. So we need to think about, for a given metric, how much labor is required to recalculate or remeasure that. And, let's be realistic about, how are we going to accomplish that? Where's funding going to come from? Things like that. And the example that I'm going to give you is probability of high severity fire. And you're going to see this one come back a number of different times. This is a very high performing metric in almost all of the discussions that we've been having. And so it's important to pay attention to it. But the version of this variable that is in the regional resource kits was created by a private company, which is wonderful. They did a great job. People really like this metric. But realistically, how often can we have that metric remeasured or recalculated? And we need to just be realistic about that. We want these metrics to be responsive to management actions. So and you've heard this mentioned a couple of times, we want to focus on changes to vegetation and fire risk that are most closely linked to management actions. And that's important because there are, metrics like, there can be metrics that have sort of, hard to identify linkages. So for example, particulate matter, a measure of air quality, could be impacted by a lot of other factors than just fire-related management. You might have done a prescribed fire, but there might be something else going on that's causing the air quality to be not very good. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind, that maybe that's not a good metric that's responsive to what we're doing. And a more specific example is that if we have a model that's calculating potential smoke emissions, that could be really useful, but it may not translate directly to air quality because you may have emitted smoke, but the weather or the other conditions could really change how that actually propagated into air quality, which is the thing you actually care about, is whether people are being impacted. So we want to be really careful about, what things need more work in order to try to figure out how we can establish connections between management and the outcomes we're interested in. We want the variables to be scientifically validated and able to measure resilience. So some of the variables are really new, so they haven't been validated yet. So one thing to think about there is maybe we start with a core set that we know have been validated, that we have like a up and coming set that people are intending to develop further and to be able to include. So employment from treatments is one of, Forrest mentioned this, that there's work going into measuring some of these things, but they're not yet validated. They're sort of in process. And then also there's some variables that may not be sensitive enough to measure changes in resilience. So the example here is that if we have a raw count of species richness, which is just the number of species in a particular location, that doesn't account for how many you have of each species, might not capture how robust or resilient that population is. So if you have only one of each and those individuals die, suddenly your species richness has gone way down. So that's not a very resilient landscape. That particular place on that landscape. But one nice thing here is that you might be able to use this particular metric of biodiversity along with others that might give you a better picture of the resilience. So you don't necessarily need to rely on just this one, but this one might be a great core metric for that reason. So that's just a sort of a thing to keep in mind there. We want this to be consistent with current state and federal mandates. So a nice example, of course, is the wildfire crisis strategy you just heard about. And wait for it, here it is again. Probability of high severity fire is showing up everywhere. It's showing up there and it's showing here. That's an example of trying to make sure that we're staying aligned. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. This is a really interesting criterion, this question of how understandable do you want these metrics, these core metrics to be? Is this something that you want for people to be able to just like kind of get it when you explain it without having to think about it? But the simpler it gets, it may not be as accurate in terms of capturing resilience. So the example I'm going to give you here, and we've heard a number of these variables already sort of mentioned. So in forest health, tree density might be an easy metric to explain quickly to people that they don't have to like really sit and think about. They just go, oh, it's the number of trees per area. Okay, it's either there's a lot of trees or there's not very many trees. Maybe having a lot of trees isn't good. You can make that a little bit more complex and go to stand density index, where you're now correcting for the average size of the trees. So, you know, oh, well, we actually care how big they are. If it's a lot of little teeny trees, that could be a problem or what have you. But that's more complex. Now you have to explain how you're doing that. How are you correcting for it? Why are you correcting for it? But it might get a little bit closer to what the actual concern might be about resilience. And then, you know, you can go even more complex and you can get this proportion of maximum stand density index. And Pat's example was actually a percentage of, but same thing. Now that's adjusting for site-specific factors, because some places could maybe handle more trees, and that's all right. So that's a more accurate measure of tree stress and competition, which is the resilience piece. But now you really, are you having to explain that, or are you having to go to something where Pat has just sort of like normalized it between 0 and 100, or -1 and 1? And it may just be a little less immediate to people. So the question, this is actually an open question. How important is it for a core metric to be understandable by a wider audience? So interested in feedback on that. But this just gives that sort of sense of like the range between simpler and more complex, but also more accurate. We'd love it if if these metrics were relevant to multiple resilience goals. They're trying to be efficient to make a short list. If it can cover more than one goal, that's great. And the way that we set up our goals, you know, we set them up so they overlapped. So we evaluated them in this particular process. And so here it is again. For example, probability of high severity fire is really great because it's measuring accomplishments and increased ecological integrity, because if you have a high severity fire, there's a chance that it will wipe out your forest and it will be hard for you to get a forest back again if that's what you wanted in that place. But also high severity fire is more likely to be damaging, more likely to damage structures and to threaten people. So it hits more than one of those notes at the same time. And that's kind of an advantage, another thing we like about that metric. And then finally, again, if we're trying to be efficient and we don't want to have a whole lot of metrics in this core set, we want to watch out for redundancy between the metrics. So for example, we have 4 different measures in the regional resource kits that actually have pretty good ratings from the Science Advisory Panel, but they all cover fuel loading. We probably don't need 4 metrics of fuel loading if they're basically the same, heading it towards the same thing. We probably want to pick one or find some other way to just sort of collapse this down. And then another related situation is that you can have things that are similar conceptually like that, but also created from the same modeling approach and somewhat redundant in that way. So for example, we have wildfire hazard potential, damage potential in the wildland urban interface, and ember load index are all coming from the same modeling approach. And so again, if you're a planner, you might want like one or the other of those. So again, the regional resource kits, we're not removing anything. These are all going to be in there. So if you're planning, you have a lot of richness to pick which of these things you think is most appropriate. But for a core metric, again, you might want to pick one of them or some specific one way to represent that instead of 3. So here is your whole list, just to look at it all together. And I will go ahead and thank you for your time and ask for any questions.
All right, thank you so much, MV. Go ahead and open up survey set number. We are at number 5. Please fill out survey set number 5, and we've got a couple questions. So Jen, I'll let you take it over.
Great, thanks, Sky. My interpretation of these questions is they're sort of reflecting on everything we've heard so far. So I'd like to invite Nick and Forrest to perhaps chime in on this first question, in addition to MV, any thoughts you might have. So this first question is asking about why we need a set of core metrics at all. So why do we need to reduce the number of metrics, this very rich amount of data we have? How do you maintain a comprehensive view of the system if you are reducing to a core set of metrics?
Yeah, I think that is a really good question. You know, there's some practical stuff I can see in the question about like, you know, can you get that metric? If you have like 10 of them, then that's 10 of them you have to be able to get over and over again. So that is one reason in terms of why to do it. And some of it is, you know, for communication purposes. You know, if Pat showed that report card and that had, you know, the 10 pillars and a couple of other things, and that's a lot of numbers to look at, and that is already a simplified view of a very complex system. So I think that those are some of the things you're hearing. And I appreciate that. But yeah, I think it is actually an open question. You know, how do you maintain a comprehensive view while sort of reducing the complexity of it? And you know, we actually would like to have that discussion with people. You know, it's a little bit of, I didn't mean to like sort of put it back on everybody, but that is a process that we're discussing.
Thanks, MV. Anything to add from the task force perspective, Nick?
No, I think MV covered it well. It's definitely a challenge, and why we know that for planning purposes, you're going to need a whole range, which is why we have 80 plus in each kit. And then each different type of application is potentially going to draw on a different set of those metrics. So we are floating this list today of core reporting metrics to get a sense of how well we're capturing some of these drivers and the important assets and risks that are part of everybody's work here, making sure are there gaps that we need to fill, identifying places where new data comes in. I think in corresponding to the general public, while they're asking for something beyond acres treated, providing them with 80 different data sets to showcase how things are going could be equally confusing. So we're trying to find that balance.
Thank you. And Nick, while you're on screen, I'll give you this question. Who does the task force see as your target audience for these core reporting metrics? Do you see, are these core reporting metrics intended for a particular target audience, or are there multiple?
We are hoping to have these be descriptive of the type of work that all our partner agencies are doing in terms of advancing forest, rangeland, and landscape resilience. I think that we would like to be able to elevate these in our action plan update and showcase the work that is being done there, and continue to do to track and report out on the accomplishments beyond acres treated in that purpose, and be able to change them up as new issues arise and we identify new challenges that we're facing.
Thank you. And then these next two questions, I think are focusing on the probability of high severity fire, since they appeared a few times. So again, Nick, maybe you're best positioned to answer this. John, Pat, please feel free to come on camera and chime in if you have something to add. So first question is, does the likelihood of high severity fire mean the same thing in all ecosystems?
Yeah, I think that's also a really important question that I don't know enough about the details of that particular variable. And so again, maybe that is something that John can comment on, because he's worked more directly with getting those into the kits. Or I don't know if Pat is if the variable that she is using for their process, if it's that same kind of variable or not. But I think it's important to think about that when we're thinking about the sort of relevance throughout the state, the sort of statewide question. And it seems to me that it could be possible to create a variable, either that one or something related to it, where you could try to make it somehow ecosystem specific, so that you could kind of get a sense of, yeah, like maybe it's okay. Something that seems severe in one place may actually not be a problem. I think that's a legitimate question. But you guys can comment on the actual variable itself that we're talking about.
Yeah, well, in the RRK, again, you can go check it in the metric dictionary. I don't have time to check it, but I believe it's 80% of the live vegetation is killed or more. And so, yeah, so it is. What does that mean? That means, 80% of the trees, 80% of the shrubs, 80% of the grassland. So it is based on a criteria that may have different relevance for what the impact is. And I think that's what's in the RRK right now.
I'll just chime in a little bit that I think, this is both a good illustration of how any one of these metrics, and this one in particular, the probability of high intensity or high severity fire, has a lot of things brought to sort of generating that meaningful representation, likelihood being just one of those input factors that's considered. So probably not productive to get into a lot of detail here, but as John said, you can go to the dictionary for any of the resource kits, it has that same metric in every single one of them. And it also has resources that one can pursue to better understand that. But I think it's really helpful. I'm glad the question was asked, because if this is, it's useful to get into some of the more details for some of these really high impact core metrics, as MV pointed out, that it'd be helpful to bring more of that kind of detail to any kind of description of what that core metric does and how it's built.
Thanks, everybody. And there are 2 other questions specifically about the probability of high severity fire, but I'm going to use my judgment and encourage those folks to share their thoughts and their questions and concerns about that metric in the post-workshop survey, which I know we'll talk about again, but my understanding is specifically to invite all of your feedback on each of these candidate metrics that we'll see here in a moment. So I think otherwise we're ready to move on, Skye.
Thank you, Jen. Yes, and we will be sure to address those questions that are unanswered if you get those into that survey. But let's go ahead and move into our final presentation for the day. So Nick Enstis from the task force is going to be going over the actual list of candidate metrics that we are putting forward and provide a little framing for that. So go ahead, Nick.
Great. Thank you, Skye. And is my presentation showing appropriately?
See ya.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, good morning to everybody. And thanks again for taking some time on your Friday to discuss metrics. As described earlier by MV, we've gone through a lot of science, policy, and alignment review discussions to this point, and we still have a lot more work to do. Today's discussion is a key step in that process in getting your feedback on these metrics. A bit later, we'll provide some more details on next steps, but at this point, I would like to share some of the key challenges we've encountered as we move through this process. I hope this will provide important context for what we have done to date, as well as for your review after the workshop. A key challenge we face, and an important note of consideration for your review, has been finding metrics that speak to impacts across the breadth of our forested and shrubland ecosystems. In general, metrics tend to be more readily available for forest systems. To fill this gap, we sought to identify metrics that can also represent shrub and chaparral systems, but those are often only available for smaller regions of the state. For ecosystem services like water supply and air quality, changes as a result of treatments are only one factor among many that determine the outcome. For example, if an area continues to receive substantial precipitation each year, treatments may not be perceivable in terms of the water supply benefits that they could provide. Or if a wildfire burns through a treated area on a good dispersion day and no downwind communities are impacted, then any reduced emissions or PM from the treatment may not translate into air quality improvements. In these areas, among others, there's more development that needs to take place, and we are working with partners to find a meaningful path forward. Similarly, for biodiversity, often there are key species of interest, but they're usually located in discrete regions, and their presence or absence may depend on additional factors beyond habitat. Treatments tend to directly affect or protect potential habitat, so we focused more on measures related to habitat quality at this time, but we know that focal species are important for both partners and the state. Some of the same challenges mentioned above also apply to social and economic factors, the regional differences in populations, risk, and wildlands, the number of factors that apply to determining social and economic health, and data availability across broader regions of the state. Additionally, there are different ways treatments could be evaluated in terms of their impact. There may be opportunities to show direct observations of change, like before or after treatments for large tree carbon, or modeled changes as a result of treatments, like probability high severity fire. For some important metrics, we may not have direct data measures, but we can highlight how much work is happening in and around key areas. For example, the metric of fire ignition probability is based on past ignitions. So roadside hardening treatment may not directly change that layer. But, for example, If there's an area of I-5 that has a history of a lot of past ignitions, we may be able to demonstrate how treatments to reduce future ignition risks were concentrated in that area. It would not directly show the impact of that work, but it would demonstrate how funded projects are being focused where the need is greatest. I want to take a moment to note that there are distinct processes underway to determine the path forward as it relates to monitoring and adaptive management, and that the metrics on the list on the next page and our current work overall is specifically focused on reporting. There are other challenges we face in this process, but hopefully this offers you perspective on our approach, and that is helpful to you as you review the list of candidate core reporting metrics and provide your feedback. So without further ado, let's get into the candidate core reporting metrics. To orient you on this list, the first column is resource values, which are similar to, but not a direct match to the pillars. This is because core reporting metrics are a subset of the full metric sets in the RRKs and are focused on the impacts of treatments reported in the interagency treatment tracking system, which, as Forrest alluded to earlier, are focused on vegetation management treatments. Therefore, some of the names are altered from the pillar names to avoid confusion around the scope of the metrics included. The elements column ties to the resilience framework definitions and offers perspective on the distinct components that are important to assessing each resource value. And then we have the core reporting metric name and their data source. I know that the individual metrics on this list may be somewhat, mostly, or entirely new to you all. As such, we will share the list and dictionary after the meeting. Hopefully, that will give you more time to dive into the metrics and to provide your comments. With that in mind, what we'll do now is take a brisk walk through the list and provide a brief explanation of the metrics. So let's start with fire risk to communities, which, as I mentioned previously, is a bit distinct from the pillar name of fire adaptive communities because of the focus on activities associated with vegetation treatments. There are other key tools missing from our available data, like home hardening, which are critical activities towards achieving fire adaptive communities. The Fire Adaptive Communities Work Group is currently exploring key metrics associated with that pillar, and we look forward to including their findings. For now, our candidate list includes 2 different measures of damage and structure risk to the WUI from adjacent landscapes, each taking a bit of a different approach. The third, fire ignition probability, helps account for the importance of ignition reduction activities in an area where risk is prevalent, especially for communities surrounded by shrublands and chaparral. For landscape resilience, probability of high severity fire will help us understand how treatments are impacting expected fire behavior, and proportion of maximum stand density index, as described earlier in Pat's presentation, can help us understand how treatments have affected competition. Large tree density applies only to forest lands, but is a critical measure for a number of reasons, such as habitat, recreation, and carbon. FRID condition class can help identify landscapes that are still out of sync with historic rates and therefore potentially still at risk. And it can highlight areas in chaparral systems that are still having too frequent of fires. Coming to biodiversity, I want to note that wetlands and riparian habitats are critical to both biodiversity and water. We do not yet have candidate metrics that are sensitive to treatment impacts for these systems, and we are exploring potential options like riparian corridor fire risk and meadow extent. For now, we include 3 metrics. Wildlife species richness is a data set that factors in habitat suitability so treatments can impact its outcomes. Habitat connectivity and climate refugia represent key areas on the landscape for protection. Similar to what I described before with regards to fire ignition probability, it will be helpful to showcase that we are focusing work to protect these areas. For carbon storage, we include 3 layers that individually tell a story and together help give a picture of stability. A treatment, for example, could reduce total above ground carbon immediately after the treatment, but if a greater proportion of total above ground carbon is transitioned into the large tree carbon pool as a result of the treatment, it can indicate an increase in resilience and longer term carbon storage. Dead carbon represents a critical pool for habitat and fire risk, and reporting on the resulting change in dead carbon from treatments is important. There are data sets being developed that better apply to chaparral systems, and we look forward to their potential availability to update this category. Under water security, reporting out on actual evapotranspiration fraction can help us understand how much a treatment affected local water balance, and if competition for water remains strong, or if more water may have the opportunity to move downstream. Next is spring runoff. Snowpack and streams are critical to our water supply, but attributing changes to this measure from discrete treatments could be a challenge, hence the asterisk. A debris flow risk layer is currently a work in progress and could be available later this year for parts of the state. Debris flows affect water quality and, if they happen above a dam, could reduce storage. So understanding how treatments may impact debris flow risk is important. As described earlier, connecting treatments with resulting impacts on air quality is a challenge. Potential total smoke production is a layer in our kits we can draw from, but further work is needed to find out if this, or a different metric, will help us report on treatment accomplishments towards reducing air quality impacts. Finally, we have social and economic health. This is another area where work is very much ongoing. The three listed here represent layers currently under development that we expect to be ready later this year. We are working with partners to identify additional metrics to better represent the breadth of social and economic impacts treatments can have. And that concludes the candidate list of core reporting metrics. We know this has been a quick glimpse into the list, and we want to make sure you have time to review and deliberate before providing feedback. Following the workshop, you will receive a copy of this list along with a data dictionary and with brief descriptions of the individual metrics, as well as how to access the full descriptions within the regional resource kits. So I'll turn it now back over to Sky to go over some of our key touch points for the next few months related to these metrics, as well as what to expect in terms of outreach and engagement following the workshop. Sky?
Thanks, Nick. And if you can go to the next slide. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so thank you all for attending through this workshop. Just wanted to give a glimpse into the next steps of the process here. So today, we'll be opening up a survey on the core reporting metrics with the list that Nick just showed. Over the next couple months, we'll be aggregating and integrating that workshop and survey feedback. And then going into March, the U.S. Forest Service will be sharing their initial nationwide metrics. This is relating to Pat Manley's presentation earlier today. And then going into the spring, in April, we'll be applying a small test of these, small set of these core reporting metrics into the Southern California region in preparation for a next task force meeting that'll be taking place in Escondido. Going through the spring and summer, we'll be continuing to vet these reporting metrics with partners and through, with task force partners and agencies. And then finally, the end goal is to integrate these core reporting metrics into the task force action plan update. So that is our plan going forward. I'll go briefly into the actual review steps for the core metrics themselves, and then we will open it up for Q&A. Okay. So I will go ahead and just share immediately following today's presentation. I will email each of you this review packet. The review packet will include the survey itself, which is linked here. You will have 1 month from today to complete this survey. So surveys are due end of day March 8th. If you have questions regarding the survey or feedback process itself, ask that you email both myself and Nick. Our emails will be included here. The packet also includes, as was described, the list itself, as well as links to in-depth definitions of all of these terms, as well as an abridged version that just kind of focuses on the candidate metrics themselves and as in a format that's a little more digestible. So that is what we have for you to review. And if you can also just finish at this point, finish up the survey for today's workshop, and then we will open it up for Q&A for the remainder of the session for any of our panelists from today. So thank you all very much for attending today's workshop. Your input is invaluable, and we really appreciate you attending. Additionally, last point, we will be putting today's presentation recording on the task force website. We'll be doing that early next week. All right, thank you all.
So Sky, we have one question right now. Is it okay to move into that?
Please do.
Okay, great. My understanding is that this could be answered by any of our presenters. It's a question about how these metrics will be reported. Are they going to be reported as standalone metrics or reported in conjunction with each other? The example this question writer gave was, example, large tree density as a standalone, or can it be combined with probability of high severity fire?
It's a great question. And I encourage my co-presenters to chime in, but once we come to agreement on a set of reporting metrics, I think there may be the opportunities to tease out specific different metrics that you can apply and build and showcase more of a pillar level analysis approach to it. But there will be other ones that will need to be maintained on their own. They have their own importance, and that can vary by region. So I think that's very much an open question that we are looking to explore and making sure that the information that we're sharing is the right level for our stakeholders and for the people that we're reporting out to. And that's one of the reasons why the surveys and your responses are so important, because we want to understand how you would use it and what's important to report from your perspective. So I think that would provide us guidance.
I was just going to add, I think that the sort of the early application that the wildfire crisis strategy landscape work sort of makes possible for us, and or is provides this opportunity for us to explore as a community here in California, how to combine sort of condition and risk at that metric level, at the pillar level, and the overall landscape level. So there's as Nick stated, I think that there's the opportunity and value actually in each of those levels, depending on what your the receiving sort of stakeholder group is, or the scale at which you're trying to make inferences about progress toward objectives. So I think we're working together, and again on this WCS landscape application to together build as sort of flexible a system as possible. So I think we'll look forward to how to combine these things, but also keep those individual parts and pieces as meaningful and accessible as possible.
Yeah, and also I think from a scientific perspective, the value is having the comprehensive perspective, because they make sort of tangible and quantitative the trade-offs that come with some of these choices. And so if you only have some of the metrics, you might not see the trade-offs that you're making. And so that, I think it's just sort of vital to understand those trade-offs. And that's why putting them all together in sort of this pillar framework is so valuable. We see all the consequences, just not a couple.
Thank you all. Next question is, who will actually be reporting on these metrics? Who will be sharing the numbers on whatever core reporting metrics are identified? And at what scale will that reporting be delivered?
We are still working on that answer. We want to make sure that the scale we're reporting at maintains the scientific integrity of the data sets that we're using. I think the ultimate goal is to have at least statewide reporting, maybe region-wide, the task force regions being able to report out on those. But I don't want to, that's very much still under discussion, and we need to better understand what the data conveys and how to scientifically ensure validity and that we're that in cohesiveness across that message. And it may also vary by ecotype. If we need to, we may have some that are specific to shrubland and chaparral systems. So it's very much a work in progress. And please share your thoughts in your survey responses.
Thanks, Nick. And Sky, as of now, that's the end of the questions. Nope. I knew this would come. I knew that would happen. Another question just popped up, so let me give it a read here. Let's see. Is there or would there be the potential or feasibility to utilize project level or regional level field-based monitoring data with the core metrics in analysis of treatment outcomes?
We definitely want to collaborate with the monitoring efforts that are going on and ensure that we're not getting anything crosswise. That, as I mentioned, that's a process that is happening in other arenas at this point, and they are moving through, and we're coordinating and collaborating to assure that we're aligned and that we're that the pathways of communication are open. I do feel like we will want to make sure that we are reporting out on the measures that are appropriate and that monitoring effort is showing, but we need to have these process. We are focused primarily right now, or solely, sorry, on the reporting side of things and watching and collaborating with the monitoring development that's going on elsewhere.
Thanks, Nick. For now, those are all of our questions. So I'll turn it back to you, Sky.
Okay, perfect. That then, if there are no other questions, concludes our workshop presentation. So thank you all very much. Please keep a lookout for that email with the survey on the candidate metrics that should be coming to your inbox in the next few minutes. And we will hold on for just a couple minutes in case anyone has any last questions, but otherwise you are all good to go. Thank you so much for your time. Have a good day.